Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Chapter 1. The Dance Floor Revival. Delphine stood frozen in the middle of the community center dance floor, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it over the bass line, thumping through the speakers, across the polished wood floor, through the spinning disco lights, and the crowd of people swaying to old school R&B. She saw him, Marcus Whitfield. The same angular jaw, now silver with age, the same deep-set eyes that used to make her stomach flip when she was 19. He was staring right back at her, his mouth slightly open like he'd seen a ghost. Her daughter, Shanice, was tugging at her arm, saying something about leaving, but Delphine couldn't move. 40 years had passed since she'd last seen this man. Since he'd broken her heart into pieces so small, she thought she'd never be whole again. And now here he was, at her goddaughter's 50th birthday party in Oakland, walking toward her like no time had passed at all. Her hands started trembling. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear into the crowd of elderly black folks doing the electric slide, but her feet wouldn't obey. Marcus moved through the crowd with the same confident stride she remembered, though now he used a cane. His cream linen suit fit him perfectly, and even at 62, he still had that presence that made people step aside without realizing they were doing it. Delphine felt herself pulling at her purple dress, suddenly self-conscious about the extra weight she carried, the gray streaks in her locks, the reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. When he finally reached her close enough that she could smell his cologne, different from what he used to wear, but just as expensive, he didn't say hello. He didn't apologize for disappearing from her life in 1985 without a word, leaving her pregnant and alone. Instead, he held out his hand and said, "They're playing our song, D. Dance with me." The audacity of this man made her want to slap him and pull him close at the same time. Behind her, Shanice sucked her teeth loud enough to be heard over the music, but Marcus kept his hand extended, waiting. The DJ had transitioned into Luther Vandross's Here and Now, and Delphine felt her resolve crumbling like old concrete. This was the song they danced to at her senior prom, the night he'd first told her he loved her, the night that had changed everything. Her mind screamed at her to walk away, to protect herself the way she should have 40 years ago. But her body had other plans. She placed her hand in his, and the touch sent electricity up her arm that made her gasp. Marcus pulled her gently into his arms, and they began to sway. His hand on her lower back felt familiar and foreign at once. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, could hear the whispers starting, could imagine the gossip that would spread through Oakland's black community by morning. "You look beautiful," Marcus whispered into her ear, and his breath on her neck made her knees weak. Delphine wanted to pull away, to demand answers, to scream at him for what he'd done, but instead, she let herself sink into the dance, into the feeling of being held by the only man who'd ever made her feel like she was flying and drowning at the same time. The song was almost over when Marcus pulled back slightly to look at her face. His eyes were wet with tears, and she realized hers were too. I never stopped thinking about you," he said, his voice cracking. "Not one single day in 40 years. Delphine felt anger surge through her chest, hot and fierce. How dare he say that to her? How dare he stand here acting like his feelings mattered after what he'd done? She opened her mouth to tell him exactly where he could go with his tears and his memories. But before she could speak, Marcus did something that made the entire room gasp. He lowered himself slowly, painfully, down onto one knee right there on the dance floor, his cane clattering to the ground beside him. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, the same midnight blue as the one he'd used 40 years ago. "Delphine Marie Johnson, He said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I was a fool to let you go. I was a coward who ran from the best thing that ever happened to me. But I'm here now, and I'm asking you the same question I asked you in 1985 before I lost my mind and my courage." He opened the box to reveal a diamond ring that caught the disco lights and threw rainbows across his tear-stained face. "Will you marry me?" The music had stopped. The entire party had gone silent. Delphine looked down at this man kneeling before her, this ghost from her past offering her the future he'd stolen from her decades ago. Her daughter was pushing through the crowd now, anger written all over her face, ready to protect her mother from more heartbreak. But Delphine held up one hand to stop Shanice, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. She had questions. God, did she have questions? Where had he been? Why had he left? What made him think he could just waltz back into her life after 40 years and expect her to fall at his feet? But looking at him now, seeing the desperation and hope and love in his eyes, she realized something that terrified her more than anything else. Despite everything, despite the pain and the years and the life she'd built without him, part of her still wanted to say yes. Part of her still loved this man who destroyed her, and that realization made her heart break all over again. Chapter 2. The First Proposal. The summer of 1985 was the hottest Detroit had seen in 30 years, and Delphine felt like she was burning up from the inside out for reasons that had nothing to do with the weather. She was 19 years old, working double shifts at the diner on 8 Mile Road, saving every penny she could to afford nursing school in the fall. Her mother had died 2 years earlier from breast cancer, leaving Delphine to raise her 2 younger brothers in their tiny apartment in the projects. Life was hard, money was tight, and most days she felt like she was drowning in responsibilities that should have belonged to someone older, someone stronger, someone who wasn't still a teenager themselves. But then Marcus Whitfield walked into the diner one afternoon in June, all smooth confidence and expensive clothes that didn't belong in her neighborhood. And suddenly Delphine had a reason to smile again. He was 25, visiting from California, where he worked for some tech company that was about to go public. He said he was in Detroit checking on his grandmother, but Delphine suspected he was really running from something, though she never asked what. He came to the diner every day for 2 weeks straight, always sitting in her section, always leaving tips that were bigger than the meal cost, always looking at her like she was the most fascinating woman he'd ever seen. By the 3rd week, Marcus had convinced her to go out with him. He took her to places she'd only seen in magazines, fancy restaurants downtown where the waiters wore tuxedos, jazz clubs where the music made her soul feel lighter, art galleries where she pretended to understand the paintings while Marcus explained them with passion in his voice. He never made her feel poor or uneducated or out of place. Instead, he made her feel like she belonged anywhere she wanted to be. He talked about taking her to California, about showing her the ocean, about building a life together that didn't involve roach-infested apartments and bill collectors banging on the door at midnight. Delphine knew she was falling too hard too fast, knew her aunties would call her foolish for trusting a man she barely knew, but she couldn't help herself. Marcus made her believe in possibilities she'd stopped dreaming about years ago. He made her feel like maybe, just maybe, life could be more than survival. He made her feel like she deserved to be loved, not for what she could do for someone else, but just for being herself. And when he kissed her for the first time under the stars in Belle Isle Park, Delphine felt like she'd finally found the home she'd been searching for since her mother died. 3 months into their relationship, everything changed. Delphine woke up one morning feeling sick to her stomach, and by the time she'd thrown up for the 3rd day in a row, she knew exactly what was happening. The pregnancy test confirmed her fears with 2 pink lines that might as well have been prison bars. She was pregnant, 19 years old, with 2 younger brothers depending on her, and a boyfriend who lived 2,000 miles away in California. Terror gripped her throat so tight she could barely breathe. She spent 3 days trying to figure out how to tell Marcus, imagining 100 different scenarios of how he might react, most of them ending with him disappearing from her life forever. But when she finally worked up the courage to tell him over dinner at their favorite soul food spot, Marcus surprised her. He didn't run, he didn't get angry. Instead, his face lit up like someone had turned on a light inside him. "Marry me," he said immediately, reaching across the table to grab her hands. "Dee, marry me. I was going to wait a few more months, do this properly with a fancy proposal and everything, but this is perfect. This is a sign. Marry me and we'll move to California together. You and the baby and your brothers. I'll take care of all of you, I promise." Delphine sat there in shock, tears streaming down her face, trying to process what was happening. Marcus was already pulling a ring box out of his jacket pocket, a beautiful diamond solitaire that must have cost more than she made in 6 months. "I bought this 2 weeks ago," he admitted, his own eyes wet with emotion. "I've been carrying it around, waiting for the perfect moment, but there's no moment more perfect than this. Say yes, Dee. Say you'll be my wife. Say you'll let me love you and take care of you the way you deserve." Delphine looked at this man who had walked into her life like a miracle, offering her everything she'd ever wanted but never dared to hope for. She thought about her mother, about how she'd worked herself to death trying to provide for her children, about how she never had anyone to lean on or depend on. She thought about her brothers and the baby growing inside her and the crushing weight of responsibility that she carried alone. And she thought about Marcus, about his gentle hands and his ambitious dreams and the way he made her feel like she was worthy of something better than the life she'd been living. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaking with hope and fear and love all tangled together. "Yes, I'll marry you." They spent the next 2 weeks planning their future in breathless conversations that stretched late into the night. Marcus would fly back to California to finalize some business deals and find them a house with enough room for her brothers. Delphine would give notice at the diner and start packing up the apartment. They'd get married in a small ceremony before the baby started showing, then move west to start their new life together. It all seemed too good to be true, too perfect, too easy. And Delphine should have known that when something seems too good to be true, it usually is. On the day, Marcus was supposed to fly back to California just a week before their planned wedding date. Delphine woke up to an empty bed and a note on the pillow. Her hands shook so badly she could barely unfold the paper. The message was short, devastating, final. "I'm sorry, I can't do this. I'm not strong enough to be what you need. Forgive me." And just like that, Marcus Whitfield vanished from her life like he'd never existed at all, leaving behind nothing but an engagement ring, a broken heart, and a baby girl who would grow up asking questions about her father that Delphine couldn't answer. Chapter 3, Building a Life from Ruins. Delphine stood in the bathroom of her apartment 3 days after Marcus left, staring at herself in the cracked mirror and trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her face was puffy, and she could already see the slight swell of her belly starting to show. She'd called Marcus's number in California 47 times, and every single call went to a disconnected line. She tried to find him through his grandmother, but the old woman had moved out of her house on the east side, and none of the neighbors knew where she'd gone. It was like Marcus had been a dream, a beautiful hallucination her desperate heart had conjured up to give her hope. Except the baby inside her was very real, and so was the ring sitting in her drawer, and so was the fact that she was now completely and utterly alone. Her Aunt Beverly came by that evening and found Delphine sitting on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the pieces of the life she thought she was going to have. "Baby girl," Aunt Beverly said, lowering herself down beside Delphine with a grunt. You got two choices right now. You can let this break you, or you can let it make you. But either way, you got to choose today because that baby needs you to be strong. Choosing strength was the hardest thing Delphine had ever done. She kept working at the diner until her 8th month, ignoring the whispers and the pitying looks from customers who'd seen her walking around with Marcus like they were the picture of young love. She sold the engagement ring to a pawn shop for a fraction of what it was worth and used the money to buy a crib and baby clothes and prenatal vitamins. Her brother stepped up in ways that made her heart swell with pride. 14-year-old Jerome took on a paper route to help with rent, and 12-year-old Terrence started mowing lawns for the elderly ladies in the neighborhood. They became a team, the four of them against the world. And when Shanice Marie Johnson was born on a cold February morning in 1986, Delphine looked at her daughter's perfect face and made a promise. She would never let another man have the power to destroy her like Marcus had. She would build a life so solid, so strong, so unshakable that no one could ever take it away from her. She would show her daughter that a woman didn't need a man to be whole, to be successful, to be happy. She would prove to the world and to herself that Marcus Whitfield's leaving was not the end of her story, but the beginning. The next 20 years were a blur of hustle and sacrifice and small victories that added up to something bigger than Delphine had ever imagined possible. She went to nursing school at night while working during the day, studying with textbooks balanced on her lap while breastfeeding Shanice. Her brothers graduated high school, both of them getting scholarships to college that made Delphine cry with pride at their graduation ceremonies. She worked her way up from bedside nurse to charge nurse-to-nurse manager at Detroit Receiving Hospital, earning respect and promotions through sheer determination and skill. She bought a house in a decent neighborhood where the schools were good and the streets were safe, a modest brick bungalow with a porch where she and Shanice would sit on summer evenings watching the fireflies dance. She dated occasionally, careful relationships with good men who treated her well but never quite reached the part of her heart that was still locked away behind walls she'd built after Marcus left. And she raised Shanice to be strong, independent, educated, and proud. A woman who would never have to depend on anyone else for her happiness or her survival. But despite everything Delphine accomplished, despite the life she built and the strength she found, there was always a ghost in her heart. She never told Shanice the full truth about her father, just that he was young and scared and not ready to be a parent. She never told anyone about the nights she still dreamed about Marcus, about waking up reaching for him before remembering he was gone. She never admitted that every time she saw an interracial couple walking down the street, her heart would jump thinking maybe, impossibly, it might be him. She kept the hurt buried deep, locked in a place she never let anyone see, not even her daughter or her brothers or her closest friends. It became part of her foundation, that old pain, something she built her strength on top of, like concrete poured over broken ground. And she convinced herself she was over it, that she'd moved on, that Marcus Whitfield was just a chapter in her past that no longer had any power over her present. She believed that lie for 40 years, right up until the moment she saw him standing across that dance floor and her entire carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. By the time Delphine moved to Oakland in 2020 to be closer to Shanice and her grandchildren, she'd become someone completely different from the terrified 19-year-old girl who'd been abandoned by the man she loved. She was 60 years old, retired from nursing with a comfortable pension, respected in her community, and secure in who she was. She had friends who loved her, a daughter who made her proud, 3 beautiful grandchildren who called her Nana and made her laugh until her sides hurt. She volunteered at a free clinic in East Oakland, traveled to jazz festivals across the country, and took salsa dancing lessons at the community center every Tuesday night. Her life was full, rich, complete. She didn't need a man, didn't want one, didn't even think about romance. anymore except in the abstract way you might think about a country you visited once long ago and never planned to return to. She was content, she was happy, she was whole, or at least that's what she told herself every single day, repeating it like a prayer until she almost believed it was true. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. Delphine's living room felt smaller than usual, with Shanice pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor like a caged tiger. They'd left the party immediately after Marcus's proposal, Delphine's head spinning so badly she'd barely been able to walk to the car. Now her daughter stood in front of her, eyes blazing with a fury that reminded Delphine of herself at that age. "You cannot be seriously considering this, Mama. Tell me you're not actually thinking about saying yes to this man." Shanice's voice rose with each word, her hands gesturing wildly. "This man who abandoned you when you were pregnant. This man who left you with nothing. This man who wasn't there for my first steps, my first words, my first day of school, my graduation, my wedding, the birth of my children. This ghost who disappeared for 40 years shows up at a party and gets down on one knee, and you're just gonna forget all that?" Delphine sat on her couch, still wearing her purple dress, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite organize into sense. She knew her daughter was right. Of course Shanice was right, but that didn't change the fact that when Marcus had held her on that dance floor, Delphine had felt something she hadn't felt in 40 years. Like she was complete. "I'm not saying I'm going to marry him," Delphine said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm saying I need to hear his story. I need to understand what happened. Baby, I've carried this weight for 40 years, wondering why, torturing myself with questions that had no answers. He owes me the truth, and I deserve to hear it. That doesn't mean I'm going to fall back into his arms like some lovesick fool. It just means I need closure." Shanice stopped pacing and turned to face her mother, tears streaming down her face now instead of just anger. "Closure? Mama, you want closure from the man who broke you? I remember the nights I heard you crying in your room when you thought I was asleep. I remember how hard you worked to give me everything, how tired you always were, how you never dated seriously because you were too scared to trust anyone again. That man did that to you, and now he thinks he can just show up with some tears and a ring and erase 40 years of pain. Where was he when we needed him? Where was he when you were working doubles just to keep the lights on?" The doorbell rang before Delphine could answer, and both women froze. Shanice looked at her mother with wide eyes. "If that's him, I swear to God, Mama, I will lose my mind." But Delphine was already standing, smoothing down her dress, her heart hammering in her chest. She moved to the door and looked. Through the peephole, Marcus stood on her porch, still in his cream suit, looking nervous and hopeful and terrified all at once. Delphine took a deep breath and opened the door. "How did you find out where I live?" she asked, not moving aside to let him in. Marcus held up his phone. "I asked your goddaughter, Rochelle. I told her I needed to explain that I couldn't let another 40 years pass without you knowing the truth. She gave me your address, but said if I hurt you again, she'd personally end me." He managed a weak smile. "I believe her too. That woman is scary." Behind Delphine, Shanice appeared in the hallway, her arms crossed over her chest. "I'm scarier," she said, her voice cold as ice. "And unlike Rochelle, I won't wait 40 years to come for you." Marcus's eyes landed on Shanice, and Delphine watched as his face transformed. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. His eyes filled with tears that spilled over and ran down his cheeks. "Shanice," he whispered, his voice breaking on her name. "My God, you look just like your mother did at your age. You're beautiful. You're so beautiful." He took a step forward, his hand reaching out like he wanted to touch her. But Shanice stepped back, her expression hard. You don't get to cry over me. You don't get to act like you know me or care about me. You're a stranger. You're less than a stranger. You're the coward who ran away from his responsibilities." Marcus's hand dropped to his side, and he nodded, absorbing the hit like he deserved it. You're right, you're absolutely right, but please, both of you, give me 1 hour. 1 hour to explain what happened. After that, if you want me to leave and never come back, I will. I'll disappear again, and you'll never have to see me or think about me. But I need you to know the truth, not because it excuses what I did. Nothing can excuse that, but because you deserve to understand. Delphine looked at her daughter, seeing the war playing out on Shanice's face. Part of her wanted to protect her mother from more pain, but part of her, the part that had always wondered about her father, needed to know too. Finally, Shanice gave a tight nod. 1 hour, but I'm staying right here, and if I don't like what I hear, you're leaving. They all moved into the living room, an awkward arrangement where Marcus sat alone on one side, while Delphine and Shanice sat together on the couch opposite him, united against whatever he was about to say. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees, his eyes red from crying. The morning I left, he began, his voice rough. I got a call from California. My business partner told me that if I didn't come back immediately, we were going to lose everything. Our company was built on money I'd borrowed from some very dangerous people, the kind who don't forgive debts and don't accept excuses. They were coming for me, Dee. They had my name, my address, everything. And they'd made it very clear what would happen to anyone connected to me if I didn't pay them back. I had 72 hours to come up with $500,000, or they were going to kill me and anyone I loved. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating, changing everything and nothing all at once. Chapter 5. The truth unfolds. Marcus's hand shook as he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of secrets he'd held for 4 decades. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I should have told you, should have asked for help, should have brought you with me and figured it out together. And you're right, I should have, but I was 25 years old and terrified out of my mind. These men had shown me pictures of what they did to people who didn't pay. Bodies in dumpsters, families destroyed, children hurt. He looked directly at Delphine's stomach, as if he could still see the baby that had been there 40 years ago. I couldn't let them find out about you and Shanice. I couldn't risk bringing that evil into your life. So I ran. I went back to California and I spent the next 5 years working around the clock, doing things I'm not proud of, selling everything I had, living in my car, just trying to pay off that debt and stay alive. By the time I was free, by the time it was safe to come looking for you, you'd moved. Your apartment was empty, your brothers were gone. I tried to find you, Dee. God knows I tried. But you disappeared and I figured maybe that was for the best. Maybe you'd moved on and built a good life without me. His voice cracked on the last words and he dropped his face into his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient inside him. Shanice leaned forward, her voice sharp as a knife. So, you're telling us that instead of being honest, instead of giving my mother the choice to stand by you or leave, you made the decision for her? You played God with all our lives because you thought you knew what was best? Do you have any idea how insulting that is? How arrogant? Marcus looked up at her, his face wet with tears, and nodded. You're absolutely right. I was arrogant. I was stupid. I thought I was protecting you, but really I was protecting myself from having to watch you both get hurt because of my mistakes. I thought I was being noble, but I was just being a coward. Your mother would have figured something out. She's the strongest person I've ever known, but I didn't give her that chance because I was scared. Not just of those men, but of disappointing her, of failing her, of not being the man she thought I was. He turned his attention fully to Delphine now, his eyes pleading. I never married. I never had other children. I built my company back up, made more money than I ever dreamed of, traveled the world, tried to fill the hole you left in my heart, but nothing worked. Every woman I dated, I compared to you. Every time I saw a little girl, I wondered if Shanice looked like that. Every time I passed the hospital. I wondered if you'd made it to nursing school like you wanted. Delphine sat perfectly still, her mind processing everything Marcus had said, trying to separate her emotions from the facts, trying to understand what this all meant. Part of her understood his fear, could even see how a terrified young man might make such a catastrophic choice, thinking he was doing the right thing. But another part of her, the part that had raised Shanice alone, that had worked herself to exhaustion, that had cried herself to sleep more nights than she could count, that part was screaming at her not to let him off the hook so easily. "You say you tried to find me," she said slowly, each word carefully measured. "How hard did you try? Did you hire a private investigator? Did you contact my Aunt Beverly? Did you check hospital employment records in Detroit? Or did you make a few phone calls, come up empty, and decide that was enough effort to ease your conscience?" The question landed like a slap, and Marcus flinched. "I looked for 3 years," he said quietly. "But no, I didn't hire an investigator. I didn't have the money at first, and by the time I did, I convinced myself you wouldn't want to be found. I told myself you built a life without me and I'd just be disrupting it. I was a coward, Dee. I've already admitted that. But I never stopped loving you. I never stopped regretting what I did." "Love," Shanice said, the word dripping with disgust. "You're really going to sit here and talk about love? Love doesn't abandon people. Love doesn't make life-altering decisions without consulting the other person. Love doesn't leave a pregnant teenager to figure things out alone. Whatever you felt for my mother, it wasn't love. It was selfishness disguised as protection." Marcus absorbed the blow, his face crumbling. "Maybe you're right. Maybe what I felt wasn't love, or maybe I didn't know how to love properly, but it was real to me. It consumed me. It's consumed me for 40 years. Why do you think I never married? Why do you think I came back to Detroit every year for 20 years trying to find her? Why do you think I almost had a heart attack when I saw her at that party tonight? Because she's been it for me. The only one. The one who got away because I was too stupid and scared to hold on." He turned back to Delphine, his eyes desperate. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not even asking you to give me another chance. I just needed you to know that I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I loved you too much to let my mistakes destroy you." Delphine stood up abruptly, her mind too full of thoughts to sit still any longer. She walked to the window and looked out at her quiet Oakland street, at the oak trees lining the sidewalk, at the normal world continuing on while her own world spun in chaos. Behind her, she could feel Marcus and Shanice watching, waiting for her to say something, anything. She thought about the 19-year-old girl she'd been, so full of hope and dreams and trust. She thought about the woman she'd become, forged in the fire of abandonment and hardship into something stronger than she'd ever imagined she could be. She thought about the years of wondering, the nights of crying, the questions that had haunted her like ghosts. And she thought about the feeling of being in Marcus's arms on that dance floor, of how her body had remembered him, even though her mind screamed at her to run away. "I need time," she finally said, not turning around. "This is too much to process in one night. You can't just show up after 40 years with a tragic story and expect everything to be okay. That's not how real life works. That's not how healing works. I need time to think, to process, to figure out what I feel underneath all the anger and hurt and confusion." Chapter 6, Unexpected Complications. 3 days passed before Delphine agreed to see Marcus again. She spent those days in a fog of conflicting emotions, barely sleeping, barely eating, driving Shanice crazy with her pacing and her silence. Her daughter had made her position clear. She wanted nothing to do with Marcus and thought her mother was making a mistake, even considering any kind of relationship with him. But Shanice also respected her mother enough to step back and let her make her own choices, even if those choices terrified her. On the 4th day, Delphine texted Marcus and asked him to meet her at Lake Merritt, in the park where she often walked in the early mornings before the sun got too hot. She needed to see him somewhere public, somewhere with air and space, not trapped in her living room with her daughter's judgment hanging over them. Marcus was already there when she arrived, sitting on a bench overlooking the water, feeding breadcrumbs to the ducks that gathered at his feet. He looked older than he had at the party, more tired, like the weight of his confession had aged him overnight. But when he saw her approaching, his face transformed with a smile so bright it made her heart stutter in her chest. She reminded herself to be strong, to keep her walls up, to not let that smile affect her the way it used to. But God, it was hard. They walked together around the lake, not touching, maintaining a careful distance between them like a force field that neither of them dared to breach. Marcus talked about his life over the past 40 years, how he'd built a software company in Silicon Valley that had eventually sold for millions, how he tried and failed at relationships with women who weren't her, how he devoted himself to work because it was the only thing that kept him from drowning in regret. He told her about his health issues, a heart attack 3 years ago that had forced him to slow down, the cancer scare last year that had turned out to be benign but had made him face his own mortality. That's when I started really searching for you again, he said, pausing to look out over the water. When I thought I might die, the only thing I could think about was dying without seeing you again, without knowing if you were okay, without telling you the truth. I hired the best private investigator money could buy. It took him 6 months, but he found you here in Oakland. I've known where you were for 8 months, Dee. I've driven past your house a dozen times, trying to work up the courage to knock on your door. I came to the party that night because I knew you'd be there. I set it up. I needed to see you. The revelation hit Delphine like cold water to the face. You set it up? You manipulated the situation to force a confrontation? Her voice rose, drawing looks from other people walking around the lake. Rochelle knew you were coming. She was in on this? Marcus held up his hands defensively. Not exactly. I told her I'd heard through mutual friends that you lived in Oakland now, and I asked if she thought you'd be at the party. She said yes, but she also said that if I was thinking about ambushing you, I should reconsider because you'd built a good life and didn't need any ghosts from your past disrupting it. But I couldn't stay away, Dee. I tried. God knows I tried. But I needed to see you, even if you told me to go to hell. Delphine felt anger rising in her chest, hot and fierce. This man had not only abandoned her 40 years ago, but now he'd manipulated his way back into her life, instead of being honest and reaching out directly. You could have called me. You could have written a letter. You could have given me the choice of whether to see you, instead of springing yourself on me at a party like some kind of dramatic movie scene. Do you not see how that's still you making decisions for me? Still you controlling the narrative? Marcus's face fell, and he sat down heavily on a nearby bench, his cane nearly slipping from his fingers. You're right. You're absolutely right. And I have no excuse. I'm still the same scared coward I was at 25, still trying to control things instead of trusting you to make your own choices. I told myself it would be more romantic to see you in person, that a letter or a phone call wouldn't do justice to what I needed to say. But really, I was just scared you'd refuse to see me if I gave you the option. I was selfish again. I'm sorry. Delphine stood over him, her hands on her hips, her mind racing. She should walk away right now. She should tell him to never contact her again. She should protect herself the way she'd learned to do over 40 years of surviving without him. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the slump of his shoulders, the genuine remorse in his voice, the way he wasn't making excuses or trying to manipulate her with charm. Or maybe it was the part of her heart that had never quite let him go. The part that had been waiting for decades for exactly this moment, even if she'd never admitted to herself. Tell me something, she said, her voice softer now. Why propose? Why not just apologize and try to be friends? Why jump straight to marriage like no time has passed? Marcus looked up at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her breath catch. Because I wasted 40 years. Because we're in our 60s now and we don't have time to waste on slow rebuilds and tentative friendship. Because the moment I saw you at that party, I knew, I've always known, that you're the only woman I've ever wanted to spend my life with. I know I don't deserve a second chance. I know I broke something precious that might never be fixed. But I had to ask. I had to put it out there. I had to let you know that if you could find it in, forgive me, even a little, I would spend every remaining day of my life trying to make up for what I did. I'm not asking you to forget the past. I'm asking if maybe we could build a future anyway, despite it. His words hung in the air between them, heavy with hope and desperation. Delphine felt her resolve wavering, felt the walls she'd built starting to crack. She thought about Shanice's anger, about the very reasonable objections to even considering this man's proposal. But she also thought about the way her heart had felt on that dance floor, about the electricity of his touch, about the stubborn, foolish part of her that still loved him despite everything. I need more time, she said finally, and I need you to prove that you've changed, that you're not just the same scared boy running from his problems. Chapter 7. The investigation. Shanice sat across from her mother at the breakfast table, her laptop open, her expression serious as death. Mama, before you make any decision about this man, I need you to see something. She turned the computer around, and Delphine found herself looking at a detailed background report on Marcus Whitfield. Her daughter had clearly hired someone to investigate him, and the results were extensive. Financial records, property ownership, past relationships, business dealings, legal history. It was all there, laid out like evidence in a courtroom. I know you might be mad at me for doing this, Shanice said, her voice defensive, but I'm your daughter and it's my job to protect you. This man hurt you once. I needed to know if he was telling the truth or if this was some kind of long con. Delphine felt conflicting emotions rise in her chest. Anger at her daughter for going behind her back, but also gratitude that someone was watching out for her, doing the research she'd been too emotional to do herself. She pulled the laptop closer and began to read, her heart in her throat, not sure if she wanted to find evidence that Marcus was lying or proof that he'd been telling the truth all along. The records painted an interesting picture. Marcus Whitfield was indeed wealthy, very wealthy. His software company had sold to Microsoft in 2015 for $240 million, and he'd invested wisely since then. He owned property in California, a condo in Detroit, and an apartment in New York. His credit was impeccable. His tax record showed massive charitable donations over the years, particularly to organizations supporting single mothers and children's education. There was no evidence of a criminal record, no history of domestic violence, no secret families or hidden scandals. But there was something else that made Delphine's breath catch. Starting in 1990 and continuing every year since, Marcus had made anonymous donations to a specific scholarship fund at Wayne State University in Detroit. The scholarship was for single mothers pursuing nursing degrees. The exact amount varied by year, but he'd given over $1 million to the fund over the past 35 years. Delphine's hands started shaking as she read the details. He set this up, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He set up a scholarship for women like I was, women like I would have been if I'd finished school right away. Oh, God. Shanice's expression softened slightly, though her jaw remained tight. Keep reading, Mama. Look at the section about his trips to Detroit. Delphine scrolled down and found travel records showing that Marcus had indeed come to Detroit regularly, multiple times a year for the first decade after he'd left, then annually after that. The investigator had included credit card statements showing charges at hotels, restaurants, and even payments to private investigators. He'd hired 4 different people over the years to try to find her, The most recent search had started 18 months ago and was ongoing until 8 months ago when the investigator had located her in Oakland. There were copies of old missing person inquiries, requests to hospitals for employee verification, searches of nursing registries. The evidence was undeniable. Marcus had been telling the truth about trying to find her. He hadn't just made a few token efforts and given up. He'd spent decades and significant money trying to locate her, even when it seemed hopeless. Delphine felt tears sliding down her cheeks, her emotions a tangled mess of validation, anger, grief, and something that felt dangerously like forgiveness. "This doesn't excuse what he did," Shanice said firmly, reaching across the table to take her mother's hand. "It doesn't erase 40 years of pain. It doesn't make him a hero. But I'll admit, he wasn't lying about most of it." "Most of it?" Delphine looked up at her daughter, her stomach dropping. "What else is there?" Shanice clicked to another tab, and Delphine found herself looking at social media photos from 15 years ago. Marcus at various events, always with the same woman, a beautiful black woman named Patricia Henderson. The photos spanned about 5 years, showing them at galas, vacations, dinners. They looked happy together, intimate. Delphine felt jealousy spike through her chest, sharp and unexpected. "He said he never had a serious relationship," Delphine said, her voice tight. "He said he never got close to marrying anyone else." Shanice nodded. "I noticed that too. So I had the investigator look into this Patricia woman. Turns out she was a nurse, just like you wanted to be. She grew up in Detroit, just like you. She was raising her younger siblings after her parents died, just like you. Mama, he dated a woman who was basically a clone of who you were. And according to the records, he broke up with her abruptly, just like he did with you. Apparently, he told her he couldn't commit because he was still in love with someone else. The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Marcus had tried to replace Delphine with someone similar but couldn't go through with it. Delphine didn't know if that made things better or worse. The doorbell rang, interrupting the tension. Delphine opened it to find Marcus standing there, looking nervous and hopeful. But before he could speak, Shanice appeared behind her mother, the laptop still in her hands. "We need to talk," Shanice said, her voice cold. "All three of us. And this time I want the complete truth, not the sanitized version you gave us to make yourself look better." Marcus's face went pale, and he nodded slowly. "You investigated me. That's smart. That's what any good daughter would do. Come in then. Let me tell you about Patricia. Let me tell you about every woman I tried and failed to love. Let me show you just how completely your mother has haunted me for 40 years. He stepped into the house, and Delphine noticed for the first time how much he was leaning on his cane, how much older he looked than he had just days ago. But she steeled herself against sympathy. Her daughter was right. They needed the complete truth, not just the parts that made Marcus look like a tragic romantic hero. They needed to see all of him, flaws and failures and lies and all, before Delphine could make any kind of decision about their future. They sat in the living room again. The same formation as before, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was evidence now, facts, records that couldn't be denied or spun. Marcus sat forward, his hands clasped, his face showing the exhaustion of a man carrying 40 years of secrets. "Patricia was my last attempt at moving on," he began, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "I met her at a fundraiser in 2008. She reminded me so much of Dee that it physically hurt to look at her. I thought maybe that was a sign. Maybe the universe was giving me a second chance with someone similar enough that I could finally let go of the past. We dated for 5 years. She was kind, intelligent, beautiful, everything any man should want. She wanted to marry me, she wanted children, and God knows I tried to love her the way she deserved. But every time I looked at her, I only saw what I'd lost. Every time she laughed, I heard Dee's laugh instead. Every time we made plans for the future, I thought about the future. I destroyed. It wasn't fair to her, so I ended it. I told her the truth, that I was still in love with someone else, someone from my past, and until I dealt with that, I couldn't give her what she needed. He looked directly at Delphine. I've hurt people trying to get over you. I've wasted my life loving a ghost, and I know that doesn't paint me in a good light, but it's the truth, the complete, pathetic truth. Chapter 8, The Daughter's Revelation. The conversation that followed was brutal in its honesty. Marcus laid out everything, every relationship that had failed, every time he'd pulled away from someone who was getting too close, every self-destructive choice he'd made because he couldn't let go of his first love. He talked about the therapy he'd finally started 5 years ago, about the depression that had nearly killed him after his heart attack, about the moment he'd realized he needed to stop running from his past and face it head on. Delphine listened, her emotions swinging wildly between sympathy and anger, between wanting to comfort him and wanting to hurt him the way he'd hurt her. Shanice sat silently through most of it, her face unreadable, until finally she held up her hand to stop Marcus mid-sentence. "I need to say something," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "And I need both of you to listen without interrupting me." She took a deep breath, her eyes welling with tears. "I grew up knowing my father didn't want me. That's what I believed my whole life. Mama never said it directly, but I could read between the lines. He left before I was born, never come back, never reached out. So I assumed I wasn't enough to make him stay. I built my whole identity around being the daughter who wasn't wanted." Tears were streaming down Shanice's face now, years of pain finally breaking through the strong exterior she'd always maintained. "I became a perfectionist because I thought maybe if I was good enough, smart enough, successful enough, it would somehow retroactively make me worth staying for. I've been in therapy for 10 years working through abandonment issues. I've struggled in my own marriage because I was always waiting for my husband to leave like my father did. I've been so scared of messing up with my own children because I didn't want them to feel unwanted the way I felt unwanted my entire life." She looked at Marcus, her voice breaking. "And now you show up and tell me that actually you did want me. You left to protect me. You thought about me for 40 years. How am I supposed to process that? How am I supposed to reconcile the trauma of believing I wasn't enough with this new narrative that says you love me so much you left? It's messing with my head, and I'm angry at you for that. I'm angry at you for leaving, and I'm angry at you for coming back, and I'm angry that I can't even hate you properly anymore because I understand your reasons, even though they were terrible reasons." Her voice rose to almost a shout. "You should have stayed. You should have trusted us to figure it out together. You should have let us choose." Marcus was openly sobbing now, his carefully maintained composure completely shattered. I know I should have. And I'm so sorry. I'm so deeply, profoundly sorry that my cowardice shaped your life in such a painful way. I didn't know. I didn't let myself imagine what it would be like for you growing up without a father because I couldn't bear to think about it. I told myself you'd be fine, that Dee was strong enough for both of us, that you'd never even miss me. But that was just more lies. I told myself to feel less guilty. The truth is, I failed you. I failed both of you. And no amount of scholarships or charity work or searching can make up for that failure. I know that. But I'm here now, and I know it's 40 years too late. But I'm here and I want to know you. I want to be part of your life if you'll let me. Not as a father. I didn't earn that title, but as someone who cares about you deeply and always has, even from a distance. He wiped his face roughly with his hands, looking older and more broken than Delphine had ever seen him. I have pictures of you. My investigator sent me photos over the years. I have pictures of your high school graduation, your wedding, your children's births. I've been a ghost in your life, watching from the shadows, too much of a coward to step into the light. Delphine stood abruptly, her hands shaking with rage. You what? You had pictures of her? You were watching her grow up from a distance like some kind of stalker, and you didn't think to actually be present? You didn't think that maybe, just maybe, we would have wanted you there, danger or no danger? Her voice was shaking now, 40 years of suppressed anger finally erupting. I defended you in my mind for decades. I told myself you must have had good reasons. I told myself you probably thought about us sometimes. But this, having pictures and still staying away, that's not protection, Marcus. That's not love. That's cowardice, wrapped up in a pretty bow of self-sacrifice. You wanted to have your cake and eat it too. Feel connected to us without actually doing the hard work of being present, without risking rejection or judgment or the possibility that we'd moved on without you. She was standing over him now, her chest heaving, tears running down her face. You stole 40 years from us, not just from me, but from Shanice. You stole her right to know her father. You stole my right to have a partner while raising our child. You stole our family's right to exist. And why? Because you were scared. Because some dangerous people were after you 40 years ago. At what point did you decide it was safe to come back, Marcus, after 5 years, 10, 20? When exactly did the danger pass, and why didn't you come find us then? The room fell silent, except for the sound of 3 people crying, 40 years of pain and regret and missed opportunities filling the space between them like toxic gas. Marcus sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Shanice had her arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly. Delphine stood frozen in the middle of her living room, finally understanding the full scope of what had been taken from her, from all of them. It wasn't just about a broken engagement or a failed relationship. It was about a family that never got to exist, about a daughter who grew up with a father-shaped hole in her heart, about a woman who'd had to be strong enough for 2 people when she should have had a partner by her side. The weight of it all crashed over Delphine like a wave, threatening to pull her under. She'd spent 40 years building a life, becoming strong, raising an incredible daughter, surviving and thriving despite the odds. But in this moment, all she could think about was what might have been, what they all might have been together. And that loss felt fresher and more painful than it ever had before, because now she had a face to attach to it. Now the ghost had become real, and the reality was somehow worse than the fantasy she'd built to explain his absence. Now she had to decide, was there any path forward from here, or was this pain too deep, too old, too fundamental to ever truly heal? She honestly didn't know, and that uncertainty terrified her more than anything else. Chapter 9. The breaking point. 2 weeks passed in tense limbo. Marcus had rented an apartment in Oakland and was giving them space, but he texted Delphine every morning. Nothing pushy, just simple messages like, thinking of you, or hope you're having a good day. Shanice had oscillated between rage and curiosity, finally asking Delphine one evening if she could meet with Marcus alone to ask him questions about his life, about the father she'd never known. That meeting had lasted 4 hours, and Shanice had come home with red eyes and a complicated expression that spoke of hard conversations and even harder truths. She'd told her mother that Marcus had answered every question honestly, no matter how painful, and that while she wasn't ready to call him dad, she was willing to consider letting him be part of her life in some capacity. That admission had sent Delphine's emotions spiraling even further. Her daughter was forgiving him, or at least moving toward forgiveness. What did that mean for Delphine herself? Was she obligated to forgive too? Or was she allowed to hold on to her anger even if Shanice was letting hers go? The questions kept her up at night, pacing her house in the dark, trying to untangle the knot of feelings in her chest. And then everything changed when Delphine went for her routine checkup and got news that made her whole world shift on its axis once again. The doctor's office was cold, and Delphine sat shivering in her paper gown while Dr. Chin reviewed her mammogram results with a serious expression that made Delphine's stomach drop. I'm seeing some abnormalities that concern me, Dr. Chin said, her voice gentle but professional. I I want to order a biopsy to rule out breast cancer. It might be nothing, but given your family history with your mother, we need to be thorough." The words breast cancer echoed in Delphine's head, drowning out everything else the doctor was saying. Her mother had died of breast cancer at 42, a painful, drawn-out death that had haunted Delphine's nightmares for years. She'd been vigilant about screenings, had done everything right, and still here she was, hearing those terrifying words. The biopsy was scheduled for 2 days later, and then it would be another week before results came back. Delphine walked out of that office in a daze, got in her car, and just sat there in the parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles went white. She thought about Shanice, about her grandchildren, about all the plans she'd made for retirement. She thought about Marcus and his proposal and the complicated mess of feelings she'd been sorting through, and suddenly all of it seemed trivial compared to the possibility of cancer. Life was so short, so uncertain, so fragile. Why was she wasting time being angry about the past when the future might not even exist? She didn't tell anyone about the biopsy. Not Shanice, not her friends, not Marcus. She went through the motions of normal life, smiling when she was supposed to, making small talk, pretending everything was fine while terror ate away at her insides. The biopsy itself was painful and frightening, lying on a cold table while doctors inserted needles into her breast tissue, taking samples to look for cancer cells that might already be spreading through her body. Afterwards, she went home and climbed into bed, pulling the covers over her head like she had when she was a child, and the world felt too big and scary to face. She stayed there for 2 days, telling Shanice she had a migraine, avoiding Marcus's texts, shutting down and shutting out the world while she waited for results that could change everything. On the 3rd day, Shanice showed up at her house unannounced and found her mother still in bed, unwashed, the curtains closed, the house dark. "Mama, what's wrong?" Shanice demanded, pulling back the covers and gasping at her mother's appearance. "Are you depressed? Is this about Marcus? Talk to me." And Delphine finally broke down and told her daughter everything about the mammogram, the biopsy, the waiting, the fear that was consuming her from the inside out. Shanice went into immediate action mode, calling doctors, demanding updates on test results, arranging for expedited processing of the biopsy samples. She moved into Delphine's house, refusing to leave her mother alone even for a minute. She made food that Delphine didn't eat, ran baths that Delphine didn't want to take, and sat beside her mother's bed at night, holding her hand while Delphine cried and mourned a future that might be cut short. On the 4th day of this vigil, Marcus texted Delphine, "I haven't heard from you in days. I'm worried. Can I do anything?" Shanice saw the message on her mother's phone and made a decision. She called Marcus, and within an hour, he was standing in Delphine's bedroom doorway, his face pale with shock at seeing her looking so diminished, so defeated. "What happened?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Dee, what's wrong?" Shanice explained the situation while Delphine just stared at the wall, unable to muster the energy to tell him to leave. Marcus listened with growing horror, and then he did something Delphine didn't expect. He walked to the bed, sat down beside her, and pulled her into his arms. She tried to resist, tried to maintain her walls, but she was too tired, too scared, too overwhelmed. She collapsed against his chest and sobbed like she hadn't sobbed since she was 19 years old and alone and pregnant and terrified. And Marcus held her, rocking her gently, whispering that everything would be okay, that she was strong enough to face whatever came next, that she wasn't alone this time. The test results came back 3 days later. Delphine, Shanice, and Marcus all sat together in Dr. Chen's office, a strange little family bound by crisis rather than tradition. Dr. Chen smiled as she entered, and Delphine felt her heart leap with hope. "The biopsy came back benign," the doctor said, and Delphine burst into tears of relief so intense they felt like they might tear her apart. "You don't have cancer," The abnormalities were just dense tissue and some benign calcifications. We'll continue to monitor closely given your family history, but you're okay, Delphine. You're okay. The relief was so overwhelming that Delphine thought she might pass out. Shanice was crying and laughing at the same time, holding her mother's hand like she'd never let go. And Marcus sat quietly weeping, his hand on Delphine's shoulder, looking more grateful than anyone who'd disappeared from her life for 40 years had a right to be. They left the doctor's office and stood in the parking lot, all three of them emotionally exhausted, but lighter than they'd been in weeks. Delphine looked at Marcus and Shanice standing together, this man and this daughter, both of them having shown up for her in her darkest moment, and something shifted deep in her chest, something that felt like the beginning of forgiveness, or at least the possibility of it. "Take me somewhere," she said suddenly to Marcus. "Somewhere we can talk without interruptions. Somewhere I can finally figure out what I want to do about you and us in this impossible situation we found ourselves in." Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with tears and hope. "Anywhere you want to go, Dee. I'm not going anywhere this time, I promise you that. I'm not running anymore." Chapter 10, Dancing into Tomorrow. Marcus drove Delphine to the Berkeley Hills, to a lookout point where the entire Bay Area spread out below them like a glittering carpet of lights as evening fell. They sat on a bench, watching the sun set over the Golden Gate Bridge, the sky turning shades of pink and orange and purple that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. For a long time, neither of them spoke, just sat there absorbing the beauty and the peace and the strange comfort of being together after so many years apart. Finally, Delphine broke the silence. "I almost died, Marcus. Or at least I thought I might be dying. And you know what the scariest part was? It wasn't the thought of death itself. It was the thought of dying with all this anger and hurt still locked up inside me. It was the thought of never knowing what might have been possible if I just let myself consider forgiving you." She turned to look at him, really look at him, seeing past the older face to the young man she'd loved so desperately 4 decades ago. "I'm not saying I forgive you completely. I'm not saying I'm ready to marry you, but I'm saying that life is too short and too precious to spend it holding on to pain that's eating me alive from the inside. So here's what I'm proposing instead." She took his hand, feeling that familiar electric current that still ran between them after all these years. "I want to start over," Delphine continued, her voice steady now, clear with purpose. "Not by pretending the past didn't happen, but by building something new on top of the ruins of what we used to have. I want to date you properly this time. I want to introduce you to my grandchildren and watch you get to know Shanice without the weight of 40 years of absence crushing you both. I want to see if the man you're now is someone I can trust, someone I can build a life with, someone who won't run when things get hard. I want time to heal, to process, to forgive at my own pace without pressure or proposals or grand romantic gestures." She squeezed his hand tighter. "And if, after all of that, after months or maybe even years of rebuilding trust and learning each other again, if we still feel this pull between us, this connection that hasn't faded despite everything, then maybe we can talk about marriage. Maybe we can talk about spending whatever time we have left on this earth together, but not today, not on the timeline you want, because you're scared of running out of time, on the timeline that's right for us, for me, for the healing we all need to do." She watched Marcus's face as he processed her words, saw hope and disappointment and relief all mingling together in his expression. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Delphine wondered if she'd asked for too much, if he'd get frustrated and leave again, if this was the test that would prove he hadn't really changed. But then he smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger, more like the man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "That's more than fair," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's more than I deserve. honestly. I'll take whatever you're willing to give me, D. If you want to date, we'll date. If you need a year or 5 years or 10 years, I'll wait. I've already wasted 40 years running from you. I'm not about to waste whatever time I have left by rushing you or pressuring you or making this about what I want instead of what you need. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, the gesture so familiar and tender that Delphine felt tears prick her eyes. I love you. I've loved you since I was 25 years old. I'll love you when I'm 95. That's not going to change whether you marry me tomorrow or never marry me at all. So take your time, heal, figure out what you want. I'll be right here proving to you every single day that I'm not that scared kid anymore. Over the next 6 months, they dated like teenagers with wrinkles and reading glasses. Marcus took Delphine to museums and concerts and quiet dinners where they talked for hours about everything and nothing. He showed up at her house with flowers, helped her plant a garden in her backyard, learned to cook the food she loved. He attended Shanice's children's school plays and soccer games, building relationships with his grandchildren that were tentative at first but grew stronger with each passing week. He went to therapy twice a week, working on the issues that had made him run 40 years ago, and he invited Delphine to join him for sessions where they could work through their shared trauma together with professional help. He was patient when Delphine had bad days and pulled away, giving her space, but always making sure she knew he was still there, still committed, still waiting. And slowly, gradually, like ice melting in spring, Delphine felt her walls coming down. She found herself laughing more, trusting more, imagining a future that included Marcus without the constant fear that he'd disappear again. She watched him with Shanice and saw the relationship they were building, not father and daughter exactly, but something gentler, something that honored the years they'd missed while creating something new. And she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was possible to heal from even the deepest wounds if both people were willing to do the work. On their 1-year anniversary of that first dance at the party, Marcus took Delphine back to the community center where it had all started. The same DJ was there playing the same old school R&B that had been the soundtrack to their youth. Marcus pulled Delphine onto the dance floor, and as Luther Vandross's Here and Now began to play, they swayed together just like they had a year ago, just like they had 40 years ago. But this time was different. This time there was no proposal, no grand gesture, no pressure, just two people who found their way back to each other through pain and forgiveness and hard-won trust, dancing like they had all the time in the world. I love you, Marcus whispered into her ear. And I'm so grateful you gave me another chance to get this right. Delphine pulled back to look at his face, saw the love and devotion and commitment shining in his eyes, and felt something settle deep in her soul. She leaned in and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. I love you too, she whispered back. And you know what? When I'm ready, when we're both ready, ask me again. Ask me to marry you again, because I think my answer might surprise you. Marcus's face broke into the most beautiful smile she'd ever seen, and they kept dancing, lost in the music and in each other, no longer running from the past, but walking together into a future they were finally brave enough to build. And when the song ended, they didn't let go. They just held each other close, two survivors of their own mistakes, two people who'd learned that love, real, lasting, mature love, was worth fighting for, worth waiting for, worth every hard conversation and tear and moment of uncertainty. They'd found their way back to each other after 40 years apart, and this time they were both finally ready to get it right.